Hi, I'm Ed Rosenberg and this is AgeWise. Most of us have heard stories, horrifying stories, of the abuse or neglect of the elderly. This program deals with those subjects. Our guests are Betsy Richards of Watauga County's Adult Protective Services, Laura Jane Ward, Region D Long-Term Care Ombudsman, and Dr. Emily Dakin of App State's Department of Social Work. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
First, Laura Jane, tell us what Region D is.
Region D is the local government municipality that covers the 7 counties in the northwest corner of North Carolina, including Allegheny, Ashe, Avery, Mitchell, Wilkes, Watauga, and Yancey counties.
And we know what Adult Protective Services is about. We know what social work is about. What is an ombudsman?
An ombudsman is an advocate. So in my particular circumstance, I'm an advocate for the residents in long-term care facilities, nursing homes, assisted livings, and family care homes.
Okay, well, and let's start off with some historical background when we talk about our issue. What we used to call elder abuse and neglect is now lumped under an umbrella term of elder mistreatment, and a lot of this is not necessarily due to caregiver stress, but to problems and with the caregiver, behavioral or emotional problems in a setting where there's an imbalance of power between the caregiver and the care recipient. Emily, how long has elder mistreatment been seen as a social problem, a national issue?
Well, elder mistreatment first began to be recognized in the 1970s. There was a Pulitzer Prize-winning book written by a journalist named Robert Butler that was called Why Survive Being Old in America, and that introduced the concept of elder abuse and neglect, or elder mistreatment. Around the same time, actually the same year, 1975, there was a British physician who introduced the term granny battering. So it was around that time also that other forms of family violence were beginning to be recognized, and those other forms of family violence helped to identify that violence could also happen against older adults. That recognition helped to pave the way for various policy developments in the United States that began to address elder abuse and neglect.
Well, you focus your comments on family situations. Mm-hmm. Laura Jane, you oversee institutional care for older people. Is there abuse and neglect? Is there elder mistreatment that occurs in institutions as well?
Yes, there is. And in the past 20 to 30 years, there have been a lot of reform within those facilities, but there's still quite a ways to go. And I think it's more likely for someone to be out in the community and there be abuse occurring and it not be reported or identified. And I think the possibility of it being identified when someone's in a facility are a lot greater. And there are also a lot of things in place, regulatory-wise, for a facility if it is identified that there is abuse occurring in that facility.
Can I add something? Mm-hmm. With a lot of times when you talk to the public about elder mistreatment, what is it, where does it happen, people usually think long-term care facilities. It's often not on people's radar that it actually happens in homes with families, and because that sort of violates our ideals about what a family is. So in I think many cases one of the reasons it goes so unrecognized in the community is that people don't think it can really happen when it's perpetrated by a loved one.
And in families, we believe in the privacy of the family too.
Yeah,
so a lot of this mistreatment can be almost invisible to other people. Well, let's talk about some of the specific types of elder mistreatment. We have a graphic that lists all of those, and Dr. Dakin, let me ask you to very briefly describe each one of those types of elder mistreatment. And let's start with physical abuse. How would you define that?
So that can be different kinds of things like hitting someone, pushing someone, slapping someone, all the kinds of things that would occur with physical violence.
And how about emotional abuse?
Yeah, so emotional abuse, that's also sometimes called verbal abuse, and that would be things like perhaps threatening somebody, calling somebody names, saying things that make that person feel bad about themselves.
And horrifying as it is to hear about, there can even be sexual abuse
Yeah.
of older people. Can you tell us what that entails?
Yeah, and that's perhaps one of the most hidden forms, and that's because of part of ageism has to do with thinking of older adults as being not sexual. So often that goes very, very much hidden, but there can be sexual abuse of older adults, and that would be any kind of sexual contact that's not consenting with the individual.
So we got 3 types already. There's also material abuse or financial abuse of older people. What does that involve?
And sometimes we'll call that also financial exploitation, and that would have to do with using somebody's property. So often a common scenario would be somebody that takes an older adult, say Social Security check each month and uses it for their own personal use. It could be other kinds of theft. Sometimes we hear about scams where, and this wouldn't be necessarily perpetrated by somebody known to the elder, but situations where older adults are targeted, and often their entire life savings are stolen through some of these different kinds of scams.
Sure, you need a new roof, you need
Yeah.
a new driveway,
Yeah.
You've won a jackpot,
Yeah.
you just need to send us a few $1,000s for processing and handling.
Yeah.
Things like that, and older people have to be very wary of those, and they're often particularly vulnerable and because of their life situations. How about medical abuse? That's something we don't hear about very often. Can older people be victimized in a medical sense?
Well, certainly. In my doctoral research, actually, there was, I asked older adults to define elder abuse and neglect themselves, and they defined medical abuse in terms of like mistreatment in the medical setting, like kind of ageist-based treatment where the person is maybe not talking directly to them, but rather to a family member or otherwise sort of ignoring their symptoms or their concerns.
It might also involve taking advantage of your older family members' medications.
Yeah.
Just, hey, I like that painkiller too. I think I'll use some of those. How about neglect?
Let me just add something
Sure.
to that. I just read an article that has to do with looking at aging-related issues in Appalachia specifically, and one of the things that came up in that article was that many older adults in Appalachia were finding themselves exploited based on relatives like taking and selling their various medications, or even like using their house as a location for selling drugs, either illegal drugs or else drugs that the older person may have been prescribed, and they're using the house to then sell it.
Okay, and then when we talk about physical abuse or emotional abuse or sexual abuse, we're talking about a perpetrator actively doing something that harms an older person. Neglect is a little bit different. How would you define elder neglect?
So neglect would be if somebody has assumed some sort of caregiver role and has basically not taken on the responsibilities that are associated with that. So it could be, one scenario might be if somebody was a caregiver for an individual with dementia, and that person needed to provide, either directly provide like supervision for the person, or make sure that somebody else was providing them that supervision, and the individual just, say, left for the day, and that person with dementia was able to subject themselves to possible harm, might be one situation. Or any kind of situation where somebody is physically dependent on the person, for medication, for food, for their what we'd call activities of daily living.
So neglecting someone's basic needs
Yeah.
in itself is a type of mistreatment.
Yeah.
And there are a couple other types of mistreatment as well: violation of rights, abandonment. But let's move on to going a little past the definitions. And Betsy, let me ask you, let's go through this list again. And because you work in adult protective services, what are some of the symptoms or the signs of these different types of abuse? In other words, if I have siblings who are caring for an older family member and I suspect physical abuse, what kinds of evidence might there be? What would I look for physical abuse?
You might see unusual marks or injuries, bruises or cuts, burns, things that don't make sense in day-to-day life for this person. Fearfulness of a particular person or caregiver, things like that.
Okay, and how about emotional abuse? What are some signs that an older person is being emotionally abused?
Emotional abuse is real hard to verify, but part of it would be that fearfulness. And of course, in our job and what we do, our evaluations, we would be asking questions and speaking to the adult and trying to determine if that's going on. But emotional abuse is a challenge unless the person is forthright about it.
And I imagine sexual abuse, verifying that would be a challenge too, but are there some things you look for when you get a report that an older person might be sexually abused?
That might be a report that would come from a medical provider or the hospital, and they're seeing signs of something that's indicating that has happened. But otherwise, unless the adult says something to someone, that is difficult to ascertain that that's going on.
You might see fearfulness, though, as part of that. Well, one thing I wanted to add about the bruise issue, and this would be abuse of any person, if you're seeing bruises that are at various stages of healing, that would suggest that there's been repeated physical violence against the person. So any kind of bruise pattern where it's not just like one bruise, but it's evident from the coloration that there's been several incidents against the person.
Okay, and we were talking before about identifying sexual abuse. Laura Jane, we hear some pretty awful stories about sexual abuse in long-term care facilities, often perpetrated by staff against the residents. What do you look for if you suspect, if you get a report that there might be some sexual abuse in a long-term care facility?
And typically in long-term care facilities, probably the most common form of abuse would be neglect. But there are those extreme cases that we hear about that are the sexual abuse and the physical abuse. But if I were to hear from, say, a resident or a family that had approached me, I would ask to talk to the resident alone and then get their permission, because as ombudsman, everything that my program does is resident directed. So I would encourage them to allow whoever else is able to advocate for them there at the facility to take appropriate action to notify regulatory and adult protective services so that then legal proceedings can begin against whoever the perpetrator of that abuse was. And a lot of these changes have came since the Elder Justice Act of 2010, which requires facilities, if they suspect any kind of abuse or neglect, whether that's physical, verbal, sexual, any kind of abuse, it requires them to alert law enforcement and also alert adult protective services and to immediately assure the resident's safety.
Okay, and I did want to talk about that, and perhaps you or Betsy, maybe you can answer this, because my question was going to be, are there some people who are required to report elder mistreatment, and do they have to report it only when they can verify it, or do they report it even if they suspect it?
The North Carolina statute does require everyone to report if they have a reasonable belief. So,
By everyone, you mean any citizen?
right. And a lot of times we probably get more reports from professionals just because they're more aware of the law and more aware of what they're looking for or looking at. But we do get a lot from the general public, from family members, neighbors. So anyone is supposed to report if they have that reasonable concern that an adult, a disabled adult, needs some kind of protection.
Well, what if I suspect that an older person I know is being mistreated in some way, but I'm afraid to report it because I might not be right, or because I don't want my name to get out? Mm-hmm. Are there any protections in place for people making those reports?
All the reports are considered anonymous, although we do want your information if you're willing to share it so we can get back with you about it, ask more questions, get more information if it's needed. But we do not share any of the reporter information. So basically, the reporter is anonymous. If the person chooses to remain anonymous when making the report, they can do that too.
So if someone is afraid of being identified by reporting elder abuse or afraid of repercussions, they don't have to worry about that.
Right.
Their identity is protected, and they don't even have to disclose their identity when they make the report.
That's true.
Okay. Dr. Dakin, let me ask you this. This was something that I found interesting when I looked at some of the research. The most commonly reported types of elder mistreatment are neglect and physical abuse, mm-hmm. but the most common forms of elder mistreatment mm-hmm. are financial and emotional abuse. So the mistreatment that happens most often is not what's reported most often. Why would neglect and physical abuse be most often reported when they're not the most common types of mistreatment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think perhaps with the verbal abuse or emotional abuse, it may be that people don't recognize it as obviously as being as being harmful in the way that something like physical abuse would be. That's one kind of speculation that I might have. And yet there's research that shows that there are harmful effects regardless of the type of abuse that it is. In terms of financial abuse, I'm curious what you guys think about that, why financial abuse might not be reported.
I have an opinion.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I would wonder if we have all been brought up that you don't talk about your finances. This is private and you don't do that. And it's a part of our job in doing an evaluation. That's always a challenging part because we have to learn that. Mm-hmm. What income do you have? What are your expenses? In order to really help someone, we need to know that. I would think that the reason is that it's not something you're going around talking about. I get this much money, but my son takes most of it, or it's kind of private. And the thought that this is a big part of a person's independence, and the fear that if I start telling people that my money is being taken and I can't manage it anymore, that maybe there's the fear there that someone will say, well, maybe someone needs to manage that for you.
Well, I think what you're saying also connects a lot with the sense of family obligation, mm-hmm. that a lot of people, if an older adult is being exploited financially by, say, an adult child or a grandchild maybe who's living with them, there's that sense of obligation that the person has, mm-hmm. and that sense that they should put the needs of this other person above theirs. So in their mind, it might not be obvious to them that they're even being mistreated, in the way that if somebody's hit or pushed or something, that's obviously, to most people at least, probably obviously not correct treatment. But it may not be as obvious if somebody is utilizing, a good portion of their retirement funding on a relative. It may not be as apparent to themselves or other people that they're being mistreated.
There may also be a factor of embarrassment.
Both
in the family setting, I'm embarrassed to have to acknowledge that my child is taking money from me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or I'm embarrassed to admit that I was scammed into thinking some Nigerian princess wanted to
Yes.
marry me.
There's a lot of shame in
and
that.
We don't want to do that.
Yeah.
Laura Jane, I think you had a comment.
Yeah, I think a consideration too with regards to the verbal or psychological abuse and the financial is the diagnosis of dementia is the greatest risk factor of abuse. So I think a lot of times with those two particularly, the person might not even realize or be able to verbalize that the abuse is occurring.
And it may also be a question of the severity of the type of mistreatment. For instance, we think of physical abuse as a pretty severe thing, and there are symptoms. There are cut marks, burns, bruises, etc. And it may be in the same way that if a woman is raped, she's likely to report it, but if someone just makes a suggestive remark to her, she's not as likely to report it. It's not as serious. Perhaps the more serious violations are more likely to be reported, and the more common ones, because they're less serious or less visible, maybe are less likely to be reported. Does that sound plausible?
Yeah, and going on what you're saying, it's not likely that someone who is in a room by themselves with their caregiver is going to report being slammed down into their chair or being jerked really hard and really forcefully as they are if they end up with a broken rib in the emergency room or something like that. I definitely think the severity definitely plays a factor in that.
Okay.
Your point on dementia is really an important one. That with somebody with dementia, there's just no way that unless you have a lot of outside scrutiny that you'd even be aware of the financial but the physical would be possibly more evident for somebody like that. So.
Now, Laura Jane, you mostly cover long-term care institutions, and if there's suspected mistreatment, either reported by a resident or staff or family members, then you need to investigate that. But I think we've established that most of the elder mistreatment occurs in the home. So, Betsy, if people suspect or know of elder mistreatment, how do they go about getting something done about it? They can contact you, I would think. How do they do that?
They would contact the Department of Social Services in the county where they live, and that would be the place to start. They make a report to the Adult Protective Services staff in that county at the Department of Social Services. There is a screening process. We look at several things to see if it indeed is Adult Protective Services. Sometimes it might end up being more of a law enforcement issue, in which case we will refer it to law enforcement in the county where we are. So it isn't always meet up to the criteria that we're looking at. When we're talking about abuse, we're talking about caretaker abuse. If someone else has abused an elderly or disabled person, that's assault, and that would be a law enforcement issue. So there's some kind of finer points, but the reporting is the important thing, and then we can go from there.
Okay, so for family members or for anyone who suspects family-based abuse or neglect of an older person, they can contact social services, ask for adult protective services. They're guaranteed confidentiality or anonymity if they want it. If a family member, if someone suspects elder mistreatment in a long-term care facility, they can contact the long-term care ombudsman, and the same confidentiality and anonymity there. Okay, Emily, let me ask you this. We've been talking about sort of micro-level or individual situations, abuse in the family, abuse in a nursing home. If we take a larger, more societal perspective, are there aspects of American society that lead us to tolerate mistreatment of older people in the same way that we've been fighting against sexism and racism for years? Are there social aspects of elder mistreatment?
Yeah, I definitely think that the macro aspect is an important consideration here. We do live in a very youth-focused society, and part of that is that we tend to disregard or have less respect for older people. I think one particular example of how that could be relevant is that research has shown that people who have experienced elder mistreatment have higher rates of depression. And older adults who are experiencing depression may not be as identified. And part of that relates to ageism, that if we see a younger person with symptoms of depression, that's not considered normal. But sometimes with older people who have symptoms of depression, we see that as somehow acceptable or a normal expected aspect of being an older person. And I think if we kind of tried to reduce some of that ageism within society, we would pay attention to some of these signs more, and they would help us to be more alert if somebody is at risk.
Well, thank you. I mean, we've learned an awful lot today. I appreciate you sharing your time with us. We know that elder mistreatment is a serious issue in society. It can take many forms. It can be difficult to detect and verify, and it robs older people of their dignity, their health, and their well-being. But there are people that we can access. There's help that we can get for people who live in the community, people like Betsy Richards at Adult Protective Services, for families who have someone in a long-term care institution, people like Laura Jane Ward, and people like Dr. Emily Dakin, whose research sheds light on this phenomenon. Well, that's our AgeWise program for this week. Please join us next time on AgeWise here on App TV. I'm Ed Rosenberg.